decades-old NATO alliance over military spending. In letters to a dozen major allies, Mr. Trump delivered a stern and clear warning, according to the New York Times, demanding that the countries pony up on their pledge to spend 2% of their GDP on defense, or else he may withdraw U.S. forces from Europe at a time when Europe is facing an aggressive Russia. This all comes ahead of next week's key NATO summit in Brussels, after which President Trump will sit down one-on-one with Russian President Vladimir Putin, NATO's chief adversary. CNN's Barbara Starr kicks off our coverage from the Pentagon.
President Trump sending scathing letters to America's closest allies, demanding they increase military spending to at least 2% of their economy, the NATO standard. Trump has been relentless that U.S. allies are not pulling their weight at NATO.
If all NATO members had spent just 2% of their GDP on defense last year, we would have had another $119 billion.
Mr. Trump's letter to German Chancellor Angela Merkel had an especially frosty warning. It will, however, become increasingly difficult to justify to American citizens why some countries do not share NATO's collective security burden while American soldiers continue to sacrifice their lives overseas or come home gravely wounded. A senior German official points out that in Afghanistan, Germany is the second largest contributor of foreign troops. To Norway, a not-so-subtle reminder of Norway's risk, since it remains the only NATO ally sharing a border with Russia that doesn't have a plan to meet the NATO spending target. NATO spending may be one area where there is agreement with former President Obama.
Everybody's got to step up and everybody's got to do better.
NATO spending estimates show the U.S. is well above the 2% spending standard at more than 3.5% of the U.S. economy going to defense. The U.K. is just over 2%, while Norway, Canada, and Germany are all under. But Trump could go too far in criticizing NATO at the upcoming summit just before he meets with Russian President Vladimir Putin.
If he wants to scuttle the Western alliance, and there's a lot of supposition that he does want to do that, then of course that could very well play into the hands of the Russians.
The president also making additional national security claims, tweeting just out that the Obama administration granted citizenship during the terrible Iran deal negotiation to 2,500 Iranians, including to government officials. It's a claim by an Iranian cleric that a former Obama national security official is pushing back on, saying the allegation is false and based on a Fox News report. Mr. Trump also tweeting on what he sees as success with North Korea. If not for me, we would now be at war with North Korea, even though the Pentagon says there is no evidence Kim Jong-un is giving up his weapons. And at that summit next week, as you said, Jim, President Trump's relationship with the allies, with Vladimir Putin, and progress with North Korea is expected to be front and center. Jim?
Barbara Starr at the Pentagon, my panel with me now. Phil Mudd, there's nothing wrong. In fact, it's very justified for a U.S. president to demand that NATO allies meet this level of spending. On the other hand, a president has not threatened to withdraw troops, which of course serve not just NATO, those European countries' security interests, but American security interests. How crucial is that difference?
I think there's a couple of differences here that are crucial. We should not discard this one. You're right. In terms of anybody who wants to criticize the president, look at his predecessors who have come out and said, look, Europe isn't paying their bill. Two things that are different here. You come out of the G7 and the European leaders are watching the G7 saying style is different. The president's going to show up in Europe, and if he doesn't like what he says, he's going to try to embarrass us in public. Previous presidents wouldn't do that. I think the more significant point is substance. If you think the president, or if they think the president is not going to back up his talk, watch what he said about North Korea. He shows up in Singapore. Watch what he says about tariffs. Republicans in Congress say no, and he says, I don't care. I'm going to slap tariffs on him. So he moved.
But that may feel good to withdraw U.S. troops from Germany to punish Germany, but does that serve U.S. national security interests in Europe when Russia is increasingly aggressive militarily?
I think that's the question I would ask. If you look at what Russia has done in terms of moving into Syria, but more critically, taking Crimea, interfering in Ukraine, the Europeans are going to say, this is our front doorstep, and this is the time when you say you're going to withdraw the troops in advance of your meeting with Putin, where Putin's going to say, I got the message. The president wants to deal with me like the European allies.
Nayyera, you worked in the Obama administration. As we saw there in Barbara's piece, President Obama expressed similar frustration with European allies. That's already a couple of years ago. Why aren't these countries, and we saw Canada, Germany, why aren't they meeting the 2% limit?
So there is an actual perception gap here as well. We have, I think, 5 countries right now that are meeting their goals, 8 more online at the end of this year, and they technically have until 2024, so they have a couple more years to get there. That goes on the factual side of things. Trump is playing to a feeling among his base that the United States is getting a raw deal when it comes to running the wars of the world, and in particular in bailing out Europe. Unfortunately, the bulk of our defense spending has been in Iraq and Afghanistan, which is not necessarily a NATO-approved or NATO-caused mission, and that's post 9/11, and the president himself has asked for a 10% increase on the military defense budget. So we are spending a lot on our military, but that is something entirely discretionary upon the president and the United States itself.
Filma, there was a line in the letter to Angela Merkel that caught not only my eye, but I'm sure caught the eye of Angela Merkel as well. This kind of dig that our troops are fighting and dying in these wars, in Iraq and Afghanistan principally, with the implication being German troops are not, when in fact they are the second biggest contributor in terms of personnel there. How much of a dig is that for a treaty ally to make that kind of comment?
I think it's a dig because you've got to look at not only what she's reading into the letter, but what he's going to do, as I mentioned a moment ago, when he comes out of a meeting. You can't trust him if I'm Angela Merkel and going in a meeting with him, you can't trust him to have a meaningful conversation and then not come out on Air Force One and hammer you. Remember, we got some context here. I mentioned G7 a moment ago. He's also embarrassed Angela Merkel in terms of his comments about her immigration policy, which is hugely sensitive in Germany. So if you're going into that meeting, even if it's one-on-one, and you're the Germans, you're saying, be careful, because he's going to tweet it out once you get out of the room.
And watch out for flying starbursts as well. The president also tweeted today, and we don't even know what the source of the story was. It looks like a Fox News story. He said the following: just out that the Obama administration granted citizenship during the terrible Iran deal negotiation to 2,500 Iranians, including the government officials. How big and bad is that? You worked in the Obama administration. We've spoken to officials in the Obama administration who just said it's just not true. Do you have any knowledge of something like this?
Well, it's unequivocally false, but what it gets to is Donald Trump playing into the hands of the Iranian extremists, right? You had Rudy Giuliani almost as a surrogate, even though he's not an official of the administration, out there advocating for regime change. And you have hardliners in Iran right now who are advocating to overthrow their government, potentially make it even more extreme, and their anti-American sentiment. And so that seems to be who Donald Trump allies himself with in countries around the world, right? It's the Marie Le Pen types in France. It's the Putin in Russia, and clearly in North Korea. He likes allying himself with people who are not really pro-democracy, and Iran is just the latest example of that.
And not necessarily allying himself with the facts on this particular claim here. Phil Mudd, Nayyera, thanks very much. They survived 10 days